did yesterday. Okay, good now.
Okay, great. And Marianne, you're with us as well?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful. Okay, we'll get started. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. Hello, and welcome to today's Journal Club, hosted by the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. We thank you for joining us today and appreciate all you're doing to help children during this challenging time. Our speakers today will be focusing on children in migration and the various forms of violence they often experience before, on, and after their journey. In spite of the prevalence, epidemiological research on this violence is lacking. Andreas Jude and Marian Jarzak of Ulm University in Germany will share highlights of their literature review in child abuse and neglect that spanned the past 15 years and included studies of nearly 17,000 children worldwide. In their review, they found great variance in the prevalence of physical and sexual abuse, as well as a lack of data on the countries and contexts in which the violence occurred. Please note that I have everyone on mute to avoid background noise. We welcome you to please enter your questions and comments in the questions box throughout the presentation. The speakers would very much like to hear your thoughts on the research direction of this topic. The presenters will respond to questions and comments at the end as time permits. The recording and slides will also be posted on the ISPCAN website for a limited time after the webinar. Then they will be archived and made available for members only. Dr. Andreas Jude is Chair in Child Maltreatment Epidemiology and Trends at Ulm University in Germany and is on staff at Lucerne University of Applied Sciences and Arts School of Social Work in Switzerland. He has contributed for more than a decade to the growing empirical knowledge base on agency response to child maltreatment and advocates internationally for improved epidemiological data on legal, health, and social service responses to child maltreatment. He is also an associate editor of Child Abuse and Neglect. Marian Jarzak is a research assistant in child maltreatment epidemiology and trends at the Clinic for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Psychotherapy at the University Hospital Ulm. She has several years of experience in empirical project research and management, such as marketing and sales, health service research, and legal, health, and social services responses to child maltreatment. Thank you so much, Andreas and Marianne, for being with us today. Now I'm going to turn it over to Andreas, who will be doing an introduction for us. One moment, please. Okay, we can see your screen. You're muted, Andreas.
Okay, good. This webinar was advertised with epidemiology in its title, and I've now introduced a slightly catchier title with the goal to convince you on the importance on epidemiological research on violence against children in migration. It's been a pleasure when I've asked by ISPCAN to do this review on the epidemiology of violence against children in migration. It's been published a few weeks ago in Child Abuse and Neglect, and it's even I'd say it's even a bigger pleasure to disseminate it now to such a large audience, and I'm eager to tell you about what we've been doing, and B, even more eager to listen to what you are thinking on how we can improve research, epidemiological research on violence against children in migration. This is the channel structure we will follow, and we will make sure that we have, after 3/4 of an hour, 1/4 of an hour left for your questions. And I hope Marianne and I will be able to answer them. Well, this might be trying to dig dry holes if I want to convince you on the relevance of the topic, but still I wanted to show you some numbers, some background numbers on child migration. It's by all means huge. These are some data from 2 of the newest UNICEF reports on the topic, and it's over the last few years been steadily increasing. It has been getting even more important, more relevant in recent years. But it's not just that migration numbers are huge, but also violence against children, or here in particular, child maltreatment, is highly prevalent. These are the numbers from the WHO Global Status Report on Violence Prevention in 2004, which you will find on WHO webpage. And it's not some few below 10% children who are victimized, but it's really, if you look at psychologically abused children, we are at a third of all children in general population. We're not speaking of particularly vulnerable populations, but the general child population all over the globe. When we were presenting preliminary findings on this review on the epidemiology of violence against children in migration at ISPCAN conferences back then in Prague and other conferences as well, several people came to me and said, well, it's nice to have, but shouldn't we really focus more on directly helping these vulnerable kids, investing more into support and help and practice-oriented research. And I by no means want to take away resources from this type of support or research, but I think it's not one or the other, but we should also invest in epidemiological research on the topic. And I've found the cycle that has been developed by WHO on health research and why we're doing the different steps in the cycle very helpful. So surveillance epidemiology is a first step in uncovering the size and scope of the problem. We all assume it's huge. Children in migration are a vulnerable population, but we don't exactly know how vulnerable and what are the particular vulnerabilities. And next step would be to the identification of risk and protective factors, or what are the causes, what is related to these vulnerabilities. How do we identify what and which types of to help us identify what and which type of interventions can help these vulnerable children. So the next step would be the development and evaluation of intervention, both intervention and prevention programs, to proceed to a fourth step, the implementation, the widespread implementation of things, of interventions and prevention programs that work, and disseminate them. But it's not done with that. So next step would be, again, surveillance, and the cycle goes on. In the third and fourth and fifth round. So the work isn't done. We have to steadily improve and evidence base what we are doing. For the second step on identifying risk factor and what works for whom, who is particularly vulnerable, and what might be a problem for children, particularly for children in migration, is to differentiate between the different contexts of victimization, the pathways in victimization. So armed conflicts, persecution are often at the origin of migration. It's not all the reasons that can lead to migration. And here in this review, we have looked at children in migration at the term that incorporates all types of migration populations, so refugees, asylum seekers, but also kids who have migrated because of financial instability, etc. So, but as I said, violence can be at the origin of migration. In the next step, on the move, children experience different sorts of or even the same types of violence: family separation, unsafe channel of transportation, and last but not least, in the country of arrival, violence may continue for these vulnerable people, both within the family, within the, by caregivers through child maltreatment, caregivers that are parents that are already stressed, traumatized, have low resources, and violence by caregivers, but also by the host population in form of discrimination. This is for our review been a very important distinction to look at the settings to better identify what are the reasons, the causes, the risks, and protective factors that might have led to violence, and how does this help to address violence. So far for a short intro, and I now will pass on to Marian, who will provide you with the information on methods and findings on the prevalence, the universality of violence.
Okay, so I will present a systematic approach for the review, which is based on the Prisma statement. Sorry. So you can see the search terms. We conducted the search in 3 languages: English, French, and German. And the current slide showed the English search terms. So we were focusing on children, which is represented in the first line. We are looking for the violent experiences. The terms are represented in the second line, with the migration background in the third, and the epidemiological data we want to extract in the last line. The lines were linked within the lines with OR operators and between the lines with AND operators. During our screening, we saw that one topic is not well covered by search terms. It's trafficking, because we recognize that it has its own vocabulary. For example, sexual exploitation versus a sexual victimization or abuse in the child maltreatment context. So it stands out like a more distinctive research area. We applied a Trident approach to obtain relevant literature. So in the first step, we looked at peer-reviewed articles in 10 bibliographic databases, like PubMed or Web of Science, but also in language-specific databases like BISO for German, for the German language. And in a second step, we screened different web pages for reports and policy papers, so shown in gray literature. The slide shows you on which web pages we looked at. It were, for example, the UN branches like UNICEF, IOM, WHO, but also international organizations like Save the Children or Human Rights Watch. And in the last step, after we came up with our final list of articles, we wrote to experts in the field and in different regional areas and asked them if our list is quite complete or if we had left out a very famous study that they knew of. And we also talked, as Andreas already mentioned, on conferences like the ISPEN conference in Prague or the USERV conference in Porto with experts and got also input for additional articles or sources of data. So the inclusion criteria we applied for the screening were that we are looking at children from birth to 17 years of age. They had to be first-generation migrants because they had to bring in their own migrant experiences and not the ones from the parents. To be not anecdotal or specific or valid for specific contexts, we looked at sample sizes that have at least 100 children included. And we covered the span of 15 years from 2003 to 2017. The main outcome we were looking at is epidemiological data. So the articles had to present prevalences or incidences on violence. And the investigators had to apply a definition of violence so we could categorize and compare the results in the end. The review covers caregiver-inflicted and peer-perpetrated victimization, but also violence by strangers, and as already mentioned, all forms of migration. We also tried to include a severity rating of violence, but it was not possible due to the data to at least assess the severity by the nature of the act. For example, we often had items like experienced sexual abuse, so we could not differentiate between the type of the act, for example, forced intercourse, touching, or verbal harassment. And the same was also for physical violence, so it was not special to sexual violence. Okay. So we could not include this part. So after I told about the theoretical principles of the review, I will now show you a first figure. It's a Prisma diagram. In sum, we came up with around 1,700 hits, which we could reduce to about 1,000 after removing the duplicates. And after a title and abstract screening, we had 380 full text articles to read. And the main reasons at this level for exclusion was that no epidemiological data was presented, or that the migration status was second generation or unclear, and also the age range was an important topic. We tried to gather as much articles as possible, so we wrote to authors where we had unclarities or gaps for extraction of the data, and we wrote to around 45 authors, and we got feedback from 12 authors, and a few of them could support us with additional analysis and informations. So in the end, we could come up with 17 studies we could include in our analysis, in our review. These 17 studies spread over the continents, as you see it here on the slide. Unfortunately, we have two areas where we could not research any data. It's South America and Oceania. For South America, this could maybe be improved in the future by including the Spanish language in the search, which was also recommended by an expert on a conference. But on the other hand, all the other continents are represented with similar numbers of studies, except of Europe, which has nearly twice as much as the others. Okay. The first table shows you main demographics or main characteristics of the studies and the basic child demographics. This table is sorted by the regions or the continents I just presented. And what we can see is that nearly every region has small sample sizes that just met the inclusion criterion with 100 children. And most of the studies have a mean age above 10 years of age. And we have only 2 studies with a mean age below 10 years. It's the Izutsu study and the Montgomery study in Europe. Most of the articles decided to interview older children because it's more easy to interview them. It's more complicated to address the instruments to the very young children, or it were proxy interviews with the parents and not their own migration experience, maybe. And this is also supported by the last study, the Severity study in Europe, because this is an unaccompanied migrant children sample, and it has the oldest mean age, with nearly 16 years old. In all samples, we have mostly a range of 40 to 54% females. There are 2 samples with a very low number of females. It's the just mentioned sample from Belgium with only 16% females, and it's the Izutsu study with only 30% females. And on the other hand, we have one study, it's a Stark study from Africa, where the focus is solely on girls or females. Regarding the migration status, we can see that in North America, we always have immigrants, and in Africa, they are all internally displaced children. For Asia, they were mostly named as refugees, while we have in Europe a different picture because all forms of migration are represented. And in Europe, additionally, we have the 2 unaccompanied migrant children samples. In the first step in our review, we looked separately at the internally displaced children. And what we can see here is that only 2 studies collected data on the perpetrator. It's the Stark study and the Gao and colleagues study. All studies measured various violent acts of commission, but they did not systematically differentiate between the commonly used categories like physical or emotional maltreatment, and because they mainly listed war-related experiences and recategorized them afterwards. And because of these varying concepts of violence, as well as the different types of prevalence, we have 12 months prevalence and lifetime prevalences, the studies must be compared with caution. Regarding the child maltreatment data, we could not find any consistent results on age and gender differences regarding the violent experiences. But what we found is that internally displaced children experience, it's more common to experience psychological violence and physical victimization. And this is a big difference to the following table where we look at the refugee and immigrant children. Their physical violence is more common. And contrary to popular beliefs, caregivers and not members of armed groups or other officials are the most frequent perpetrators. But as I already mentioned, we have only 2 studies who measured this information. And one of these studies is in a sample where the children had no war experience. But still, there are fundamental differences between these 2 studies. For example, the reason of migration. In the Stark study, the reason was armed conflict, and in the Gao study, it were economic reasons. And the current living arrangement were like refugee camp versus a major city, and also the geographical location, Africa versus Asia, is very different. So this makes this finding special, but unfortunately, with this low database with only 2 studies, it's not possible to come to a final conclusion. Okay. So if you look at this big table here, representing the numbers for violence against refugee and immigrant children, we can see that at least in every category, at least one category of abuse is represented. And we have only 3 refugee studies that report physical or psychological neglect, which is at the end of the table. And we can also see that studies conducted in Europe tend to report higher maltreatment rates than in the other areas. The European studies are, for example, study 2 to 4, the Montgomery or the Roof study, and on the bottom, the Vervliet study. The most common categories of victimization that were recorded are physical violence among 8 studies, witnessing violent events even in 9 studies, and sexual abuse in 5 studies. And we have here also a focus on war trauma experiences, which is represented in the traumatic experiences. These are widespread among refugee and immigrant children with 9 to 83%, and mainly cover events like witnessing explosions, bombing, gun battles, war or armed conflicts. The physical violence category is also highly prevalent among immigrant children and refugees, and here particularly prevalent among unaccompanied migrant children. They have 65 and 58% prevalence. And we have 2 studies that report physical violence in the context of bullying in samples of immigrant youth in the United States. This is the Maynard and colleague sample and the Solkowski and colleague sample. And they are the only studies that focus on victimization in the country of arrival and solely on peer victimization. But the prevalence rates differ quite a lot between them. It's more than 20%. So these mixed findings make it complicated to come to a valid interpretation, because it's the same topic in the same country, but very different in the prevalence. Okay. If we look at sexual abuse, the prevalences are between 5 to 20%, which is actually comparable to other worldwide studies, like the review of Stoltenberg and colleagues. And the sample with the unaccompanied migrant children from Vervliet and colleagues is again the one with the highest prevalence for hands-on sexual victimization with 20%. Important here is that if you remember the female part of the sample, we have here only 16% females, but we have the highest sexual victimization in this sample. We have another sample with hand-on sexual acts, which is distinctly lower with 5%. It's a German refugee sample by Roof from 2008. And in the bullying study by Maynard and colleagues, verbal sexual abuse was also included and is represented with 14%. So as I already mentioned, we had to categorize a lot of different acts in one category because we had a lot of missing informations or detailed information on the acts. Because in this category we have items that covered sexual abuse or maltreatment in general. This was collected very often in this manner. We have some studies that differentiated, so we have also forced sex and rape included, but also sexual jokes, comments, and gestures, like, for example, in the Maynard study. But as we can see, there are even broader items that just cover, for example, child maltreatment in general. It's a Gusen study from 2014, where we could not even put it in one category, but we need to put the prevalence value over all categories. Or for example, in the Feller study, physical violence and psychological violence was put in one category as an item. So it was very difficult to come up with a fair category. Neglect is only reported in 3 studies. The neglectful behavior mainly refers to a lack of food and/or shelter. And here again, the unaccompanied migrant children in the fellow study shows the highest value with a lack of access to food and water with 59%. The 2 other studies are with children accompanied by family members. They also report a lack of access to food with 19%, it's the Izutsu study, or with 14%, it's left without food or shelter, and it's the Gormes study. So it turns out, also it's not very surprisingly, that among the categories, for example, physical violence, sexual violence, neglect, that the unaccompanied migrant children belong to the most vulnerable group of the children we studied here. And these results are also supported by additional analysis. Darlene ran for us for this manuscript within her Belgian migrant sample. And she revealed again that the prevalence rates for the unaccompanied children in her sample for our age range are much more vulnerable than all the other subgroups. For example, she found out that physical violence was with a prevalence of 64% for the unaccompanied children, compared to 26 up to 41% for the other subgroups. So yeah, they are the most vulnerable ones. So what we can say is children in migration are highly vulnerable, but there's still a dearth of comparable and reliable data, and we still lack important informations on the frequencies, even on the severity, and especially even on details on the types of violence the children experienced. A lot of measurements are very general. And we have also a lack if we look at the context informations we need to assess individual or societal risks. So these areas are still much understudied. In consequence, we could say that the political debates and the policy making are rarely based on, at the moment, sufficient evidence. I would now hand back to Andreas, who will give you some additional information on the methodological challenges and recommendations we have drawn.
Well, to get back to you, I want to highlight the, in my view, striking lack of comparability of findings. Marin has tried to kind of go for solid or findings so that we think, based on the data, unaccompanied minors are most vulnerable. But if it comes down to prevalence rates, they're so hugely different that it's difficult to draw any anything out of it. And another, still there's some interesting findings we didn't yet highlight. One of it, this has been about displaced children, and even in displaced children, 2 studies did find that they're most often victimized by intrafamiliar violence and not other types of violence, war atrocities, or or police brutality. So this is there's some accidentally gone on mute. Well, the striking lack of comparability has, based on this finding, we have developed a research agenda on violence against children in migration to improve. And one goal would be to improve interdisciplinary consensus on concepts and definition. This is one of the conceptual issues. The other is to avoid arbitrariness in the comparison of violent acts. So there are these two primarily conceptual issues. We have several recommendations, and I will address conceptual and methodological issues in the slides to come. We have several issues in methodological rigor. And what I've said in the beginning is that I don't think it's either or in research on violence against children in migration. So we do not only need research to how to better help them in direct interaction. That's needed too, but I really think it's also needed to a better evidence-based epidemiologically to understand how policies and strategies work to avoid well-meant but potentially damaging policies. If you look at another, and this is the final full-packed table on conceptual and methodological issues, on the measures instruments that were used. You will see there a great variety, but I want to draw your attention to the concepts that have been assessed, and I've tried to do it a coloring exercise, coloring similar concepts in more or less similar colors, and it's been getting more colorful than a rainbow that has been assessed, and that speaks of the difficulty on or to compare these findings, and it's been also has arisen out of the many different disciplines and that have been involved in these 17 studies that we have analyzed. So, as I said, a plethora of terms and concepts, and we think one of the recommendations would be to initiate consensus processes at multidisciplinary conferences. Often research on child protection, even on child protection, on the multidisciplinary issue of child protection goes on in disciplinary silos. We're not always well connected, and that's, I think, is really an asset of ISPCAN, that it is in its core multidisciplinary, and here I think ISPCAN conferences can contribute to consensus processes on terms and concepts and their operationalization. It's also an opportunity to have subsidized all over the world. We have the opportunity to have subsidized research or research practice networks. One example in Europe is the COST action, the European subsidized by the European Cooperation in Science and Technology. And I didn't want to lose the opportunity to draw your attention to a recently initiated cost action in our domain. And if you're more interested in that one, if you get the slides, please click on the banner and you will get information on the cost action 19106. But it's not just the terms, it's as Marian has highlighted before, the striking lack of information on context of violence. And I don't think we have to altogether avoid disciplinary input in context, but at least to assess or being able to compare findings from different disciplines, from different studies on the topic. We should focus in assessment or in the instruments more on the acts and differentiate between the types of violence, perpetrators, settings of violence, and severity of acts, or maybe not just acts, but omissions too. If we proceed to methodological issues and the lack of methodological rigor, we have the problem that, or not a problem, we have many instruments on violence against children that have been developed and have been used widely, but there's still have been mostly developed in high-income countries in English, and there's a lack of translation, cultural adaptation, and standardization, lacking norms of instruments for population in low and middle income countries. This has led a lot of researchers in the studies we looked at to develop their own instruments with somewhat with issues in reliability or validity. So we have to invest in easily accessible, non-expensive, validated questionnaires, and this will be the second, but now after that I'll finish with the advertisement for ISBCAN. I think the ICAS can be a valid, reliable tool and has been already tested and in various low and middle income countries as well. But there's a caveat, particularly if we want to highlight the importance of differentiating between contexts of violence. But if we do that, we also have to look at different norms. Violence that has been experienced in the country of origin with the norms of the country of origin, but violence that has been experienced in the host country should also be looked at with norms of the host country. The second, I'll go quite quick as I do want to have some time for questions. Is not an issue that's particular or specific to research on violence against children and migration, but for all research on violence against children. And if we look at the samples in our review, they have been labeled randomized, but if you look closer, it's kind of like, I dare say, conveniently randomized. And I do acknowledge it's quite difficult to have randomized sampling in these contexts, but maybe smaller units can be methodologically more rigorous in these contexts, that it might be better to access entire population of children in refugee camp or a municipality in the country of arrival instead of having difficult to achieve randomized sampling. It's not just conceptual and methodological, but there's several ethical issues. As always, it's about weighing the gain in knowledge against the potential individual harm. Luckily, there's quite a lot of research there that that comes to the conclusion that children are usually not harmed by being asked on their violent experiences. On the contrary, they even report having benefited from being asked. But these findings also point to the fact that they prefer questionnaires over verbal interviews. So this might be a recommendation that generally the questionnaire should be given priority. Well, I could elaborate for another 3/4 of an hour on the pitfalls of Western view and violence against children and migration. And I think, and also think, I'll put it the other way, participatory research can be a tool to address these problems, but epidemiological research on violence against children or on violence against children in migration has not been very good at incorporating participatory research, but we have a few examples there in the article. So if you're interested to dig a bit deeper by reading the article. And this is my last slide I'll present for today, and to give you a reason for hope. And if we do that cycle of data collection, and if we do regularly look on trends, we might observe, as David Finkelor did for US maltreatment trends, that actually our work in looking at intervention and prevention in the context of violence against children helps and is worthwhile. As we can see, it has declined quite a bit since the 1990s. So that's, I hope in a few decades, we might be able to see some evidence for policy, that policies and interventions have worked also in the context of violence against children in migration. Thanks so much for your attention so far, and I'm eager to hear also what you think or what you would recommend to improve data collection on violence against children in migration.
Okay, thank you so much, Andreas and Marian, for sharing that information with us. And thank you for sharing that last slide, which does give us a little bit of hope. I would just like to encourage the audience to please type any questions or comments you have in the questions box as we're speaking here, and we will get to those as best we can. So I have a few questions and comments. Let me start with this one. This person is asking if you looked at the Violence Against Children survey that has been implemented in a number of countries, and specifically with internally displaced people. She's referring to certain geographic areas. She mentions Haiti, El Salvador, Honduras, and Colombia. But I guess in general, she's asking about the VAX surveys.
Marian, do you want to go first?
No, I think I have them not on mind now. I'm not sure if some reasons were given, so we had to exclude them. I think it's the age range because it's 13 to 24 years. So I think the data was not presented for the age range we needed to include with the limit at 17 years of age.
Okay. Okay.
I think just to add, like generally we have been really done a lot to include everything, and we also had help from ISCAN counselors to potentially translate studies that have been maybe written in Arabic or other languages we don't master. So I'm pretty sure we have not missed a lot in research on the epidemiology of violence against children in migration, but there might have been different reasons for why we have excluded certain popular or research on the topic, particularly as we have looked at research that directly has been collected on children aged 0 to 18 years.
Okay. Okay, great. And someone else is asking about whether the research you looked at addresses services available for abused children in these contexts.
Well, some of the studies do, but this has been a review on the prevalence of violent experiences, violent incidents, and not we didn't have a focus on service provision, even though this is, if anybody of you guys know my research, one of my main focuses, but not in this review. But there are studies who have looked at it, but several of them are about displaced people with hardly any access to services, but also like other studies do. It's not the same type that does look at. There are, or no, let me put it like this: like when we did the research, we have found a lot of studies on psychiatric or psychotherapeutic service utilization and availability, but they are really prevalent, these types of studies, but they don't look at the reasons for or potential reasons for why children have come or have used psychotherapeutic or psychiatric services, but they look at diagnosis and not violence. We might assume if they have PTSD that it's been because of violent traumatization, but it's just a guess.
Okay. Okay, here are a couple questions related to ethical issues and interviewing children. So maybe you could speak to, you know, how researchers can gain access to children in these contexts, and also one person is asking about ethical issues with children who are alone, you know, who are traveling alone without parents in terms of interviewing.
Well, yes, in the article we explored the problem, the issue that of a potential general distrust of these vulnerable children in all authoritative persons, including researchers. So this has been, this is certainly an issue that is most delicate, and it's also a thing that a reason why it's that. Or let me put it. I want to say too many things all in the same time. So this is one issue, that the potential general distrust in authoritative figures. The other thing, and this might lead to fabrication of information, or avoidance of giving information to these figures. One colleague also said there might be an advantage, for example, if to say I have an issue, I have a psychiatric diagnosis, to avoid expulsion from a host country. So there's not just the potential for underestimation of vulnerability, but also the potential for overestimation of vulnerability. Honestly, there's a few things that we have found on how to improve ethical guidelines in working with the vulnerable children, but this has, at least in the literature, we looked at the recommendations to improve epidemiological research has been rather weak, and I'd be happy to have if you have recommendations to in this regard to include or to further improve. Well, it's been a lot. I'm now have been trying to integrate several tracks, and I might have lost a bit. I might have get lost a bit. Maybe you have more concrete other that concrete questions.
Yes, I think we have time maybe for one more question. This one is about instruments, and you mentioned the instruments that were used in these studies. She's asking whether you think ICAST-C and maybe other instruments too would need adjustments to be used with migrant children.
I guess so, yeah. What's an advantage of, for example, ICAST, but also other tools that they have? They ask about the subjectivity of violent experiences. How did you experience it? How severe was it? But the concepts, at least they need to be tested if they understand if they understand the same. Well, but this on cultural sensitivity. But I don't think. I'm not sure. Maybe I was moving on too fast with what I'm saying. Like it has to be as adapted to cultural sensitivity, but I'm not sure. Yeah, now I got it. I got it. What's the most important thing? What I want to say. The most important adaptation, of course, would be the, including information on the context of violence. So most of these studies we've looked at have assessed lifetime prevalence of violence. And so we don't know, has this child been moving in the past half year? When this have been, does this type, is this child maltreatment it experienced at home, on the move, at home in the country of origin, on the move, or in the country of arrival? So this would be, I think this would be the major issue that would be needed to adapt the questionnaire to being able to differentiate the context, and with this to get information to better deal, to better develop prevention and intervention for these vulnerable children.
Okay, thank you very much. We're about out of time, so I just want to say thank you again to Andreas and Marian for sharing this information. And thank you everyone in the audience for your questions. If you have a question that didn't get answered, or you think of one that you would like to ask, please reach out to us at ISPCAN and we will do our best to get that question answered. And just in conclusion, I would like to, encourage all of you to become a member of ISPCAN if you are not already, so that we can continue having webinars like these. Our member benefits include a subscription to Child Abuse and Neglect, our monthly research journal, as well as access to our past webinars and other educational resources, the ISPCAN Child Abuse Screening Tools, or ICAST, and discounts to our congresses, which will resume in 2021. We offer several membership levels, including our new associate membership, which is $35 a year. We also invite you to visit our COVID-19 resources page on the website for a variety of resources for professionals, parents, and children. You will also find information on upcoming webinars, including our next one on September 28th on problematic sexual behavior in children. And finally, I would just like to say, to learn more about ISPCAN, please visit us at ispcan.org. A recording and the slides from today's webinar will be posted on our website shortly. If you have any other questions or comments, please contact us at resources@ispcan.org. Thank you all again for joining us today. Stay safe and healthy wherever you are, and have a great day or night. Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Marian.
You're welcome, Heather. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.